They took her scholarship, her reputation, her future. They thought one accusation would erase her dreams forever. They forgot one thing. I was there and I had nothing left to lose. I watched, I waited, and then I made sure their whole world fell. I still remember the way Emily laughed when she told me she'd been accepted. It was a small sound, the kind a person makes when something that mattered to them fits into place like the last piece of puzzle. She hugged the acceptance letter to her chest like it was a prize she had bled for, and I watched her and felt like the richest man alive. Emily was 19, sharp as a compass and stubborn where stubbornness counted. Architecture wasn't just a major to her, it was a voice. She drew buildings the way other kids doodle cartoons, except there was a steadiness to her lines, a confidence in the blueprint she assembled. She'd earned a full scholarship to one of the country's most reputable universities, a dream that meant we'd finally see returns on decades of ordinary sacrifices. For me, that letter was a promise that she could leave whatever smallness our town represented and carve something real for herself. 3 months later, she arrived home with a letter folded twice in her hands, and the light in her face had been smothered. The words inside it were clinical and precise: plagiarism, academic dishonesty, permanent notation on student record, immediate termination of scholarship. The letter read like a death sentence for everything she had planned. I remember Emily saying the words aloud as if she were listing grocery items, like she couldn't believe the stomach-churning reality. They say I copied the design. They say the design was submitted by Rachel's account. They say there's proof. Her voice was even, but her fingers were trembling. I didn't shout then. I didn't storm the university. Anger without direction is noise, and I needed a path. I sat down at the kitchen table as she curled up on the couch and told me everything she remembered about the class, the professor who'd been suspiciously hostile, and a girl named Rachel who loved to show off that she had connections. The university's response had been immediate and ruthless. They suspended the scholarship, failed the course, and marked the offense on her record. No investigation, no meeting, a single bureaucratic motion that shattered a future. So I did the only thing a man who still believed in systems could think to do first. I collected what they had taken. I asked Emily for every file she'd ever made for that project. Sketches, drafts, PDFs, tiny backup files saved at odd hours. She gave me a flash drive and a list of every cloud folder she used, and I watched her hands tremble as if the memory of the accusation had become a physical thing she couldn't shake. That night, when the house was dark and the clock ticked too loudly, I began to compare files. Names, timestamps, autosaves, submission times. I told myself I was doing this for Emily, but I also felt something else, a thick, dangerous current of something that wasn't just protection. It was a slow settling of resolve. If someone had stolen her work, I would find them. If the university had traded justice for donors, I would expose them. I felt the shift in my chest. The ordinary man's fear changing into a father's methodical fury. I promised Emily that I would not let them win. That promise had a weight to it, like a vow. People like to think institutions are immune, that money and status can mute truth. They are wrong. Institutions are fragile when the right threads are pulled. The trouble is finding the threads. I started small. I spoke to Emily's classmates in ways a father shouldn't. Quietly, politely, pretending I was asking about optics and deadlines. There were students who remembered Emily's obsessive late nights in the lab, the way she'd leave a tray of coffee cups and a mess of pencils. There were others who were too scared to speak, or too comfortable siding with the powerful. But one student, a kid named Mark with ink-stained fingers and a sneer for administration, told me something crucial. Rachel's project popped up suddenly. No one saw the process. It was handed in, polished and perfect. Weird. That was an angle. Steam from a locomotive. No build, just a finished engine. I started to dig into the digital bones of it, where the files had been created, what the metadata said, what the timestamps revealed. Emily, like most students, had started files iteratively. There were 5 versions, then 10, then small autosaves. Her drafts had times and dates that built a story you couldn't fake. Rachel's original lacked that scaffolding. It appeared at once neat and final, like a gift. The cloud servers held an echo. But the pivot came when an IT student friend, someone who owed me a favor after I paid for computer repair in the past, semi-raw logs. They were not easy to read. Strings of numbers and codes that read like ancient Sanskrit to me, but the pattern was clear. Rachel's submission followed a download from a university workstation tied to Professor Harris's office. The professor had accesses and privileges to the server that students did not. Professor Harris. I'd met him once, a man with a heavy suit and a lighter smile. Someone who taught as if building egos were as important as teaching architecture. He had a way with donors that bordered on servile, and I knew his name was in donor circles as an asset rather than a liability. With the logs in my possession, the case became less speculative. If you string timestamps together and secure corroboration, the machine of truth starts its own work. I printed the logs, I labeled them, I wrote down exactly what each entry meant. When Emily looked at me while I explained what I'd found, a flicker, like candlelight, returned her eyes. For the first time since the letter, she seemed a little less broken. The university, of course, had already made a narrative. Rachel was talented, Emily had been careless, and mistakes had been made. They had made their verdict, and the verdict padded Rachel's father's philanthropic resume. That was when I understood the scale of what I was dealing with. This wasn't a single bad actor. It was an ecosystem that protected itself. I could have gone to the administration then, with the logs and the timestamps and Emily at my side, all of us prepared to speak truth. But I knew the playbook. They would stonewall. They would bury the evidence. The important thing wasn't to show them evidence quietly. It was to make the evidence impossible to bury. So we collected more. I acquired emails showing odd file transfers. I found a copy of a draft saved inadvertently to a shared drive that linked with the professor's workstation. I asked questions that looked casual. Who had access to the shared drives? Why were submissions sometimes rerouted? The answers pushed me deeper into a map that smelled like profiteering and negligence. Then, late one night, Emily remembered something that made my stomach drop. She'd been working on a chain suggestion and walked into Professor Harris's office briefly to show him. That was the day an assistant had been in the room, a student assistant she didn't know well. Names turned into faces. Faces turned into connections. The web tightened. With 24 corroborating pieces, students' testimonies, server logs, accidentally saved drafts, I had the bones of a case. But the university still had the power of narrative and a long list of reasons to protect itself, which meant I needed one more thing: public attention. People act when they're forced to act. Reputation is a currency that collapses under public scrutiny. If I could get this to the students, the local papers, and the parents, the university would have a headache it couldn't afford to medicate away. I began carefully. I'm not a hacker. I'm a father with patience and a printer. But I also have a small competence with words. I wrote an anonymous letter to a student-run paper, attaching redacted logs and screenshots. I also prepared a dossier I planned to release if the administration refused to act. The strategy was to create ripples so big that they became waves. Social media did the rest. When the student paper published what I'd sent, the screenshot spread. A blog, then a local reporter, then a community group picked it up. The headline that first morning was small but dangerous. Questions raised over scholarship revocation. Rachel's father called the dean. There were whispers of donor influence. The administration held a closed meeting and labeled the publication as unauthorized disclosure. They tried to quell the noise by promising a review, a perfunctory announcement designed to calm anger. But students didn't calm. Emily's friends gathered signatures. Mark, the ink-stained student, organized a comparison gallery in the architecture building. He printed Emily's drafts and Rachel's final submission side by side and left them in the main hall. People stood and frowned and compared, and for the first time the administration had to reckon with bodies looking at evidence. The look of people who are awake flattens the confidence of liars. The university responded predictably. They announced an internal review and insisted no final judgment had been made. The dean said all the right words on a recorded statement, but the recorded statement sounded like someone reading an apology script written for the wrong play. The optics had shifted. Donors were uneasy. Rachel reacted badly. She lashed out at students on social media, posting photos of private moments and implying Emily's family had motives. Rachel's father issued threats through a lawyer. Professor Harris went into damage control mode, prototypical attorneys, and a rigid posture that didn't read like innocence so much as careful defense. Then a local investigative journalist, curious and relentless, reached out. He wanted the full dossier and offered to give a platform. He smelled a bigger story. What happens when money bends academic rules? We talked for hours. He asked direct questions and pushed for documentation. I gave him everything I had. If the university tried to bury this, it wouldn't be buried beneath internal memos. It would be on page 1, several coordinated posts, a student gallery, 2 local articles, and a viral thread later, the cracks widened. The university's PR team tried to spin it as a miscommunication and procedural error, but the momentum was against them. Momentum is a strange thing. It carries more than evidence. It carries the public's hunger for justice when thematically it fits a narrative the public already resents. And through it all, Emily learned to stand again. She began to speak when cameras asked. She looked into lenses and said, "I did my work. I have the files. I'll fight." Her voice was small but steady. People began sending messages of support, alumni who had faced similar things, parents who had once been in my shoes. The story became starker. A bright student nearly ruined by a system that protected its friends. Of course, they tried to pay people off. A subtle message arrived at my office. This can be settled. It was less a negotiation and more a threat that smelled of coroner's cold courtesy. I laughed at it and forwarded it to the journalist. In desperation, Rachel's circle circulated an orchestrated smear campaign. But smears rarely survive fact-checking when facts are solid. It should be said, anger was never enough for me. I wanted them to lose far more than the scholarship. I wanted them to feel the structural consequence of their choices. Justice had to be more than a reinstated file. It had to resonate. It had to reverberate in their world. The first visible collapse wasn't dramatic. It was procedural. The board called an emergency meeting to discuss donor relations and reputation management. The dean, who had once read like a man of impeccable composure, now answered questions with a throat like a wired violin, tight and high. The journalist published a long piece. It wasn't an op-ed, it was a forensic report. It laid out server logs, annotated drafts, and timelines. It quoted students, named Professor Harris's authorizations, and asked direct questions about whether the university had prioritized donations over due process. The article made it onto social media feeds and into parents' email chains. Alumni groups discussed withdrawing support. Small donors asked for refunds. Prospective students reconsidered applications. Rachel's father, who had built his public life on philanthropic veneers, began to receive vitriolic letters, not just from students, but from donors who didn't want to be associated with scandal. A board member called him and said in no uncertain terms that his contributions might cost him more than they were worth. He fumed in private meetings, his social circle shrinking. Professor Harris's life was the kind that is built on respect and influence. He'd cultivated administrators for years. But evidence has a way of eating through cultivated respect. The university suspended him pending investigation. He swung between arrogant denials and desperate assertions of being set up. His professional network, the people who benefited from his curated social calendar, slowly retreated. Then came what no one in his position had anticipated. A call from 2 other institutions where he had possible future appointments, asking, in clipped tones, whether the allegations were true. Reputation is a river of tiny tributaries. Once one goes black, the others follow. Rachel, the daughter, saw her social media collapse. Sponsors withdrew offers for internships. Private messages leaked, and small screenshots of her earlier boasting resurfaced. The critique wasn't just that she might have taken credit. It was that she had been sheltered by a system that told her behavior had no consequence. Suddenly, that shelter had holes. Meanwhile, the settlement that the university offered to present as generous felt like ashes to me. They were ready to reinstate the scholarship quietly and offer perfunctory apology. I refused. Emily deserved her story told straight, not rewritten in the sanitized language of corporate remorse. We went to a lawyer who specialized in academic disputes, a woman who had the look of someone who had been to courtrooms more than cocktail parties. She said the only way to secure a real closure was to force public accountability, to make the university answer in a way that would change how it treated justice. The suit was filed, not just for Emily's reinstatement or the emotional damages, but for the systemic failures, for the negligence that allowed a professor to manipulate access, and for the university's failure to follow fair procedure. The lawsuit named names and demanded records. Once filed, it opened a legal faucet the university could not easily close. They tried to settle again, quietly, this time offering to make Emily whole in private and to pay for counseling and a scholarship extension. I rejected that too. Private settlements allow the powerful to stage a loss without consequence. I wanted consequence. I wanted transparency. The board panicked. Donations slowed. The architecture department's chair took a leave of absence. Professor Harris's references were rescinded in a cascade I didn't orchestrate, but certainly buoyed. And then came the private donor meeting. A careful, ugly thing where wealthy people sat around and considered whether their money should keep the institution's lights on. It's a strange paradox. When an institution depends on patrons, reputational damage is less about truth and more about market perception. The board's calculus shifted when medium-sized donors and alumni groups started making their unease public. Gradually, things unraveled. The dean issued a more substantial public statement, this one framed not as protectiveness but as contrition. Professor Harris was dismissed. Rachel's scholarship offers evaporated. The university launched an official, external audit of its submission protocols. Students demanded structural reforms, transparent submission logs, third-party arbitration for disputes, and a review board with student representation. I did not celebrate the human losses in their lives. My aim had never been to break people for breaking my daughter. It was to make sure the structure that allowed abuse could no longer protect itself with silence and money. To that end, the collapse was purposeful, not to destroy lives needlessly, but to make the institution accountable. Courtrooms are slow instruments. The lawsuit dragged, with delays and motions and posturing from high-priced attorneys. But each motion forced papers into public record. Emails from administrators that once served as private assurances were subpoenaed. The truth often has a stagey way of revealing itself when compelled by law. Gradually, the lawsuit's pressure brought a settlement that looked different this time. It included a public apology recorded by the dean, published to the university site, and emails reaching prospective students. Emily's record was expunged. Her scholarship was not only reinstated but extended. There was a small fund established to audit and update submission systems. More importantly, a clause required third-party oversight for academic dishonesty hearings for 5 years. It was imperfect, but it changed the system. Professor Harris was unemployed and at first defiant. However, long after he left, the narrative had already worn him thin. He sought employment in smaller institutions and found doors closed. His professional reputation, the thing he had built, dissolved where it mattered most. Rachel's life moved outward in uncomfortable ways. She lost internships and the easy favors that come from being close to power. People did not owe her vengeance, but her choices had consequences. And so did the choices of those who protected her. Her father retreated from public philanthropy for a time. Whether he ever truly learned anything is not for me to decide. What matters is that he could no longer buy impunity. And Emily, she recovered in ways that surprised everyone, including herself. The reinstatement came with a small scholarship ceremony, a public moment that could have been an empty pantomime, but instead felt, to me, like mending. Emily stood at a podium and spoke, not about revenge, but about responsibility and about the need to protect students' voices. She chose to return to school, and her designs matured into something older and wiser, tempered by the knowledge that institutions could break people, but also be forced to mend. People asked me at the end if I felt satisfied. The truth is complicated. I had never wanted to drive anyone into ruin. I wanted justice. But justice can look like collapse when a fragile structure built on favor and silence is forced into daylight. I watched as careers and reputations crumbled. Not because I took pleasure, but because I had to be a father who fought. The fight left marks. The fight cost time and patience and sleep. It cost us days of normalcy and nights of anxiety. Yet Emily's future, once stolen, was returned. There's a quieter epilogue. After the dust settled, I found a card in my mailbox and signed a simple note with words that felt like absolution. Thank you for not letting them hide it. It wasn't long, but it was enough. We never reveled in schadenfreude. We understood that cruelty often hides in systems, not just people. We had simply refused to let the system be the final arbiter when it chose money over human futures. In the years that followed, the university published its reforms and, reluctantly at first, implemented third-party reviews. Students better understood the tools they needed to protect their work: immutable submission logs, two-factor verification, and transparency. I sometimes think about Professor Harris, sitting in a small office somewhere, facing a diminished life of uneasy interviews. I think about Rachel, who had to learn what consequence meant. I think about donors who learned the hard lesson that reputation, however carefully curated, cannot be bought back when trust dies. But mostly I think about Emily, now older and working on a portfolio that blends structure and empathy. She designs spaces that invite people in rather than shut them out. She teaches workshops for young architects about ethics and process. The girl who once shook with fear at a single letter now steadies other tremors. If someone wonders what I would do differently, I'd answer simply, I would have started sooner. But hindsight is a teacher that arrives late. In the end, the world they try to build around themselves, a comfortable bubble of influence, collapsed not because I wanted to see them fall, but because the truth finally caught up and demanded to be heard. I kept my promise. When you attack my child's dreams, you are attacking an entire life. You cross a line you cannot uncross. And there's nothing more potent than a parent who decides to fight in the name of that life. They thought they could erase her. They only hastened their own collapse. They thought destroying my daughter's dreams would end her story, but instead it ended theirs. And remember, truth always finds its way out, no matter how deep they try to bury it. If you felt this revenge was justified, hit that like button. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories where silence turns into justice and justice into revenge.